And so today's topic is tackling trauma together, and we were collaborating with one of our affiliate partners, the Governor's Prevention Program. So as you think about this, what we're doing today, think about what brought you to this meeting, some questions you might have on the topic, and feel free to ask them throughout the session. And I'll turn it over to Jo to introduce her program and a little bit about herself.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you today. My name is Jo Hawk. I am the lead researcher and evaluator at the Governor's Prevention Partnership in Connecticut. The Governor's Prevention Partnership enhances the youth prevention and mentoring framework in Connecticut through trainings, technical assistance, and collaborative approaches. We connect people, programs, and communities to resources they need to positively affect the lives of Connecticut's youth. And that's our mission. And today we're very pleased to be able to join with a mentor, Virginia, to host this or to participate in this coffee hour with you. My role at the partnership, I'm currently the lead researcher. It's a new position that we've established at the partnership. I came to the partnership as a program manager. I have many years of experience working in the field of services for young people with trauma-related disorders. When I was at the University of Connecticut, I started a trauma-informed mentoring program for young people who had family members who had been incarcerated. And much of my research has involved systems-involved youth that are involved in juvenile justice or the child welfare system. So they're populations that have a lot of trauma experiences. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm very pleased to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Barrett.
Good morning. My name is Charles Barrett. I am a school psychologist by training. I live and work in suburban DC, up in Northern Virginia. I was a school-based psychologist for 13 years. In the last 2 years, I've been a central office administrator supporting about 65 psychologists and 8 to 10 interns, program management, and just, the work that's good for children. I still do some school-based work. Do some adjunct teaching at Howard and other universities in their school psychology programs, do some speaking and consulting, some writing, but happy to be here today. Thank you for the invitation and looking forward to engaging with the other panelists and you in the chat.
I am Ashley Williams. By practice, I'm a mind-body therapist, and coming to this training with experience as a mentor program coordinator and technical assistant with Mentor Virginia. I started my career in mentoring in 2012, working with the Department of Juvenile Justice as the reentry mentoring coordinator, and worked with that program along with other community organizations that focused on individuals and youth that were incarcerated, and then assisting them through pairing with not just peer-to-peer mentor relationships, but then also relationships as they re-entered back into their community environment and their home environment. And so during that time, I began to transition into more mind-body practices, and that's when my career shifted. And so over the past couple of years, what my work has really entailed is creating programs and spaces in which healthy relationships are created with the intersection of mind-body or mindful-based restorative practices, specifically in addressing the what we like to call like tiny T traumas, but as well as societal, familial, historical, and generational trauma, specifically here in the city of Richmond, is where a lot of my work with Bare Soul Yoga and wellness takes place, really just making these practices accessible in school and community environments. but also with the Well Collective being a space of holistic health to address trauma intergenerationally and multiculturally. And so I don't know that my work has really changed. I'm all about, building interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships just to create a more mindful and connected world that really centers humanity. So I am excited to be here as we continue to talk and find ways to support not just our young people, but those that are working with our young people in our communities in general. So looking forward to the discussion.
Okay. Are we getting ready to jump into the questions? Are we ready to do that? All righty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tamise Spencer Helms. I am the Training and DEI Manager for Mentor Virginia. It's good to be with you all this morning and to hear from Dr. Barrett and Joe and Ashley. So I'm going to start my question for you, Dr. Barrett. How is trauma exhibited in youth? How do you recognize it? And what are the immediate long-term impacts of a traumatic event on a young person?
So thank you for the invitation, for the question. I see my friend Dr. Patterson on here, so good to see you this morning. And please, everyone, call me Charles. I'm very informal, so thank you for that. Yeah, big question, so I'm going to unpack this as best I can and as quickly as I can to be mindful of our time today. So I think that trauma, let me back up. About 3 years ago, I came across the research of a pediatrician in California. Rhea Boyd, R-H-E-A Boyd, is a pediatrician at Stanford and looks at the intersection of police violence, equity, and child health outcomes. Why this is important is that I came across this during the summer of 2020, and America's going through COVID-19, but also this most recent racial awakening with the killing of Black individuals, in particular, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. So we have all these children who are home, exposed to social media more than typical, and overhearing conversations with, older siblings or parents or other family members. And this research for me was so pivotal in my understanding of trauma and how children might display behaviors in response to that. So she talks about these 3 levels of exposure to police violence and the behavioral outcomes that children might display as a result of that. So the first one is exposure to racial profiling. So we know that systemically, policing in certain communities is different, and racial profiling is a reality for young people or individuals from minoritized backgrounds. That behavior, the heightened sensitivity, does lead to symptoms of anxiety and other traumatic behaviors. So things like aggression and conduct problems, things like irritability and maybe hypervigilance could be a result of that. The one I want to focus on in particular is exposure to police violence in communities. So if you live in urban situations like Baltimore, for example, or even maybe Washington, D.C., or you live in Minneapolis or other places that might have exposure to police violence, a lot of the behavioral symptoms that I want to mention also resemble what I would call disabilities for special education. So things like PTSD symptoms, substance abuse, depression, poor self-regulation, attentional impairment, poor school performance, and even leading to school suspension and expulsion. So all of these acting out behaviors that, again, look like aggression, look like irritability, look like hyperactivity, those can be legitimate behavioral responses to exposure to either chronic violence or other things in the child's environment or immediate surroundings. There's a theory that I want to mention quickly. You might be familiar with this person, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And it basically talks about how everyone's development is a result of things going on around them. So the child that you see in your community, in your school, is really a product of a family, a product of a community, but also living in a certain time and space. So for all of us, life has changed since March of 2020. So even the overall environment of racism, of larger societal issues, all of those things affect children. Why I bring that up is that when we talk about trauma, we want to talk about what's going on around the child and not only focus on what's happening within them. Because again, these behavioral symptoms that I mentioned before could be legitimate responses to what's happening in their families, in their communities, and how they might need support to better regulate or better express those, or more effectively express their frustrations and exposure to those traumatic or stressful events. The last category that Dr. Boyd talks about in her research is exposure to caregiver encounters with police. So even seeing maybe siblings, family members, parents, aunts, uncles, that could be frightening for students. That could be disheartening for them. And also the stress that comes with at times when family members might be even taken away from the home for various reasons. So that's just a quick synopsis for me of kind of understanding where some of the trauma could come from. But broadly speaking, it's really thinking about what has the child been exposed to around them, and it might not stem from anything deficitly wrong within the person individually. The second part of the question talks about how do you recognize this? I would say, understanding who the child is, and when you see significant behavioral changes, think about, again, what's happening around the child that could be leading to these behavioral difficulties. So the child does not always present a certain way, but then you might see some aggression, attentional problems, irritability, hypervigilance, hyperactivity. Think about what might have happened at home over the weekend or what's happening around them that could lead to those changes in behavioral presentation. The immediate and long-term impacts of a traumatic event on a young person, certainly the long-term impacts, some of these things could lead to long-term mental health difficulty, the development of anxiety and depression, PTSD, and other mental health conditions. Again, being a school-based employee, being an educator for the past 15 years, I always think about the lack of access to instruction when these behavioral difficulties interfere with their ability to attend to instruction and to benefit from the learning environment. So I always think about subsequent achievement implications, and then also for becoming at risk for post-graduation outcomes. So not being as prepared for college, as prepared for the career or the workforce as a result of what's happened throughout their K-12 experience. So these things that kids are exposed to even early childhood can definitely have long-term effects for their mental health, their behavioral health, but also their post-graduation outcomes, as productive members of society. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more I can say, but that was a lot. So I definitely want you to digest that and maybe have some follow-up questions or discussion if that's available later on in the session.
Thank you for that. That's really really helpful and very clear. I hadn't thought about what it might be like to experience caretaker or watch a caretaker experience police violence and how that might play in.
Correct.
Ashley, could you talk to us a little bit about what that trauma looks like in a school setting? What does it look like? What are the effects of traumas that you're seeing or generally that you've observed in schools?
So one thing I didn't mention in this moment was that I'm also hosting the role as a mindfulness director in Richmond Public Schools, specifically in one of our elementary or one of our middle schools. And so the roles there is that we operate a mindfulness room, which teaches mindful-based restorative practices to address much of violence or traumas or situations that are occurring that are leading to high stress or traumatic experience in the community, and finding a way to do that in the school. And so we've been there for about 3 years, implementing both virtually and now, of course, in person. And the one thing or the many things that we are seeing that really are being exhibited, not just in the room, but in the school environment in general, is many things that Charles mentioned, but the reduced ability to really respond to situations. And so that's both situations that happen in the academic environment alongside other students in responding to questions or responding to questions around how are you, what's happening, and what our youth are experiencing. And so that's been a challenge within our academic setting. Of course, we're in a setting to learn and a setting to build relationships, but the communication skills to really respond and to really engage in one's environment in a way that's supportive has been something that we've been acknowledging more, and with even the academic setting, which is where the frustration then leads for many of our youth, and then of course might lead to depression, is just the actual learning environment, right? And so taking in new information, being in classes, both scholastic and extracurricular, in which you're learning something new, we're seeing like a lower ability to really figure things out, right? And so we know what the ways in which trauma maybe affects the brain, or the ability to kind of really move from one moment to the next moment with or without support. And so we're seeing a lot of frustration come from our youth when they're not able to figure things out, because sometimes there's that communication barrier of asking for the support or asking for the help in which one may need. So that results in many of our problems that happen in school. And so the way that we see that is our kids walking out of the classroom, or maybe having a burst out maybe towards the teacher, or if the classroom's really loud, then having having some frustration with just kind of like being able to focus or inability to focus. So we see a lot of moving about the hallways. I think another thing is just really increasing the difficulty, that trauma increasing the difficulty for our youth to have supportive and healthy relationships and making friends, and then also maintaining them. So of course we operate the mindfulness room. And so one thing that we see a lot is our students are coming in for support because of the peer-to-peer issues that are happening, right? It could be relational, it could be around the boyfriends or the girlfriends in any age. And I see them when I'm in elementary school, but I also see it in our middle and our high schools, or they saw their partner talking to, another person, or even just identity around both gender identity, but also sexual orientation at that age. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and then not that much space for them to really process what's actually even happening, or what's on the mind, or feelings that they're experiencing. And so those are things, if you ask the students really many times, what's causing the frustration, what's causing the outburst, it's usually because someone outside of them has done something, and that's their response, or the inability to find a response versus a reaction. And so I think I'll land there. Those are the two that I really kind of, the connection and the communication challenges that our students are having in the school environment, and then also their response to the academic setting. But I think it all boils down into, as well as, really observing our students, really finding themselves based on whatever trauma they've experienced, right? And so we're seeing a lower capacity of being able to really navigate the thoughts that are happening, really navigating the experiences that are happening. I think one thing that is actually really big in this year that I think is important to mention is suicidal ideation, right? So in the school setting, we have experienced a few youth suicides this year in Richmond Public Schools, and of our younger kids. And so with that, putting in resources for our students to really express, talk about, and share what's happening in their environments. And so one of the responses to that was also increased mentor program relationships. So I'll land there. And so thank you for that question.
Not a problem. Perfect place to land. Because that was going to be my next question. Joe, how do you think mentors can recognize some of these effects of trauma? Is it different in mentoring? Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that when we're talking about mentoring, what I'd like to add is that many times the exact reasons that children get referred to mentoring programs are because of issues that can be trauma related. Many kids, many young people experience potentially traumatic events in their lives. A recent study that I think is fairly conservative estimated that about 62% of adolescents, by the time they reach adulthood, young adulthood, have experienced at least one potentially traumatic event. If you take the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, they talk about it in terms of the average classroom of 30 students, and they estimate that about 20% haven't had any kind of event, and about a third of those students have had enough that are going to have, that could potentially have significant long-term life consequences in terms of their mental and physical health. Trauma is related to a lot of issues throughout a person's life. And I think that some of the things that my colleagues have pointed out, like, the issues around the classroom and being taken out of it, well, also they sometimes the behaviors that young people exhibit get them involved with the law, get them into the juvenile justice system, and there are consequences there for their life. What you see are what we've talked about: problems concentrating, irritability, exaggerated startle response, defiance, aggressive behavior, poor impulse control, poor social skills, depression, and leading to issues like what Ashley was talking about a minute ago. The most disturbing is self-harm and the potential for suicide ideation. So depression and relationship problems that can be inability to form relationships, but also can be becoming too promiscuous and sexual activity. When we talk about adolescents, like I said, 62% is a conservative estimate for adolescents as a general group. But when you talk about subgroups within the population, the rates are higher. Kids who are involved with the juvenile justice system or child welfare, LGBTQIA youth, the youth of color, youth that grow up in neighborhoods and environments that have high crime rates and high exposure to violence. So from a mentoring perspective, I would say we have to be trauma informed. We have to be trauma informed because even a child that doesn't seem to be having an issue can have a trauma history, that they can be triggered. They can be triggered by things like hearing all of the discussion about some event that has occurred. They can be triggered by something that we wouldn't be triggered by: a smell, a tone of voice, something that they see. They can, and what's more with adolescents and children is that they may not recognize that they're being triggered. It's true of adults too, but it's more so true of younger people because developmentally they're at a different stage. And so as a mentor, we may very easily come into contact with young people that need some help and guidance in terms of trauma recovery. And we play an important role there. I see Dr. Barrett or Charles. It'll take me a minute.
So how do mentors, just in everyday caring adults, mentors, how do they step into these situations and kind of help young folks recover from trauma? Is there something that you would recommend, Joe?
Yeah, I have 2 slides. Emma, if you could show the first one. This is a slide that's called the 3 pillars of trauma-informed mentoring. So when you talk about trauma-informed mentoring, which is what I recommend we all do, there are 3 pillars: safety, connection, and managing emotions. Safety is trauma can affect a child's sense of safety and attachment. for recovery, adults have to provide a safe and secure, a feeling of, or a sense of safety. They have to be reliable. They have to be available, predictable. Any of us who've mentored know that sometimes it seems that our mentees can be very sensitive to little things like being a little bit late for when we come to pick them up. We have to be very predictable, very regular, very honest about how we're feeling. And at the same time, look for signs of distress. While we're not clinicians, while we're not going to open up the trauma and help them kind of unpack it, we are there as a support, and we can identify the distress that we're talking about today, and if so, help them get the support that they need. When it comes to connection, we have to acknowledge that sometimes the traumas that young people have experienced involve adults, and adults have either hurt them or they may associate negative emotions with adults. So we need to be sensitive to that. They may have experienced betrayal from people who are supposed to protect them. So always be positive in how you interact with your mentee, regardless of how challenging the behavior is that they're exhibiting. You know, be positive. It's about, these are things we do as mentors anyhow, right? It's about our relationship with our mentee. We want to be there to talk to as a support. You know, be open, leave the door open for them to come to you and talk honestly about how you feel, and control. I think it's important that we control any strong emotions that we have, because we also may be trauma survivors and we may be triggered by situations. And finally, the third pillar is managing emotions. A very important thing that we as mentors we're role models. We're role models for how to cope. Many of these behaviors that we're talking about in young people that are challenging are really their attempts to cope with trauma. They're coping with trauma. So they have to learn how to cope in positive ways. And we are role models for that. We can teach them self-calming techniques. We can develop our active listening skills for them. And then also help them learn how to listen and use those skills themselves. They can be triggered very easily. So helping them calm, being developmentally appropriate when you interact with your mentee, and being aware of your own emotions. On January 6th, I'm a trauma survivor. Okay? On January 6th, I was working from home, had the news on, and I was triggered. I have to say it was a very difficult day for me. I spent the day glued to the TV, crying, very, very dysregulated. And at the end, I thought, well, if I'm feeling this way, other people are feeling this way. Young people are feeling this way too. And that led to a discussion at the partnership, and we developed a resource that I want to share with you. Emma, if you could show the next slide. This is a tip sheet, and we have guidance that goes with it. At the bottom, there's a link that you can go to, and you'll get a little bit more detail. But it doesn't necessarily say trauma informed, but this is what trauma informed is. These are the steps that you would go through in order to be a trauma informed mentor. It starts out with, I think, one of the most important things, and that's know yourself. All right, young people respond to how they see adults in their life respond. I think Charles was that's his first point, is, you know, that they live in families and communities and society, and they respond to that. So as a representative of and a supportive adult in the lives of your mentee and other children that you interact with, it's very important that you know where you're coming from and know when you're triggered and when you're dysregulated. And then the other steps are about really listening and guiding the mentee. I don't really want to take the time to go through the entire tip sheet because I have other colleagues who I know they have good information to share. But I do want to draw your attention to this. I think it's a good thing to give to your staff, if you're a mentoring staff, a mentoring provider, and it's a good thing to give to your mentors as a beginning to that conversation. So I think that's what I would share with the group.
That was very helpful, and I have been gleaning from that resource in some of my work. So thank you for creating that. Ashley, could you talk to us more about what it might look like for these kids to be able to do some mindfulness or coping techniques? Could you talk to us about some of that?
So I really appreciated the form that Joe just shared. So many of the, the practices in which we use, like the actual techniques, are meant to provide spaces of safety, create empowering and supportive environments, as well as teaching ways to regulate emotions. And I love to offer the definition of mindfulness because many times we, especially in our institutions, educational systems, is that we might look at mindfulness as, a technique or a science, right? It's this thing that we do when mindfulness is simply being able to be present with emotions that are present, feelings, moods, situations, and environments in a way that we're not judging them and we're receiving them with acceptance. And so the beautiful thing about being more mindful, right? So being in the being of being mindful versus just simply doing the techniques is that, we all have the capacity to be more mindful and to be more present of these experiences that we have, whether they are pleasant and or they are unpleasant, right? So whether they are situations in which situations in which are ones that, we're smiling about, or the situations in which are causing us to have some emotional turmoil and the experiences of trauma. So I land with that in the sense of, there are many ways for us to create more mindful spaces for our youth to explore their trauma. Going back to the definition that I tend to land on when it comes to trauma, it's undigested, unresolved emotion that's present. And so creating safe, supportive environments where our youth can get to know themselves is so key. And so when Joe mentioned, one of the best things that we can do for and in relationship with our youth is that we know ourselves. And so the practices of connecting to our present moment, how we are feeling, what's happening in our mind, what's happening in our environment, and how's that affecting what's happening in our world is key. And that's where I land on for our mentors, simply self-care. Right. And I think, that's such a word that I struggle with using sometimes because, it can look so many different ways. But our number one thing is for our mentors or our adults that are working with our young people to really know themselves so they can show up vulnerable and open with the capacity and authentically in these relationships. So when they are in relation there and we're able to receive what's happening without any judgment and with acceptance that this is not something that happened to the youth, this is something that the youth has experienced. How can I hold space for this experience without any judgment? And one practice and a couple of actual techniques to practice building this muscle of holding space and having that capacity lands with this concept of really just creating this space. And so that might look like doing a meditation, right? It's like, it's asking the questions, how does one acknowledge what's happening? It's that we have to pause. We have to actually pause. And so I really suggest these moments of what we call mindful moments, doing them with yourself first. So if that's 5 minutes in the morning, or that's 5 minutes in the middle of your day, or 5 minutes before bed, can look so many different ways. But the practice of using an anchor of your breath, right? So we always talk about our breath and just breathe, whereas that might be a trigger for some. There's different anchors, but our breath is one of the first things that tells us that we are present and we are connected. So in moments when our youth are triggered, right, it's a moment of disconnection from their environment. Senses are lost, heartbeat speeds up. And the first thing that we would want to do is to create a safe and connecting environment. And we can use these things called anchors. And that might look like our breath. So an example of this is taking a moment. It might be finding stillness and focusing on the in breath and the out breath, right? That might be the anchor, and doing it for a moment. And this is, like I'm saying, both for the mentors, but maybe you do this at the beginning of your mentor group. Maybe you do it at the end as a transition period as well. Another anchor is our body. Our body holds so much. It holds our experiences. And many times we are not present with what's happening in the body. Shoulders are tight, fists are clenched, muscles and jaw are holding our parts. Some of our parts of our body are warm. We're not eating, so then we're hungry. We're overeating. So taking a moment to use a practice called a body scan, really giving ourselves an opportunity is like, how does my body feel right now? What am I experiencing? How can I address what I'm experiencing in this moment? And so getting really familiar with these things called anchors that help us have mindful moments. It might be 5 senses. It might be affirmative words. It may be reversing negative self-talk with offering up affirmative statement, but really giving that space to teach our youth how to get to know themselves in very tangible ways. And it seems so simple by starting with these anchors, but really connecting them with those breath, sense, and body to take these mindful moments, but first doing them with yourself. And so as you go into your mentor relationships, I think one thing that we have is, our youth are usually coming from their home environment to their mentor relationship. They might be coming from their school setting to the mentor group. They may be coming from an activity into relationship with you. We don't know what we're doing when we call them. So practicing taking a pause to transition. So we're not taking what happened prior to the moment of engaging with our mentor or our mentee is key for us to even create that space of connection. Because otherwise we bring all of the emotion, thought, sensation that's happening into that moment that we're meeting. I think the last thing is that I'm going to invite in is really just the opportunity to be in practice with the active listening in which Joe mentioned. Being in practice with not having to fix what's going on, because that weight can be really heavy, but being in practice of just, I understand, I see you, I hear you. And those are simple phrases as these words go. And then maybe there's the offering of the resources and, and suggestions after that, but a simple acknowledgement that I see what's happening. I see, I hear, I feel, and I understand are key with creating a space for support and connection to happen.
Thank you for that. Actually, just incredibly grateful for the work that you do. Dr. Barrett, I want to direct this at you. How does a mentor know when additional help is needed, where a clinician is necessary for a situation? How do they help youth and family gain access to the resources they need when it's beyond kind of our pay grade as mentors?
Sure. So much great content and resources being shared by Ashley and Joe. So thank you so much for all of your comments and contributions. I think that the first thing that as a psychologist that I know that I've been trained to do is to know the limits of my training. I work with children between, 3 or 4, maybe 5 to high school. I don't do adults, I don't do marriage and family. I work with children. So I think knowing your limits and what you are capable of doing is actually an ethical imperative to what we call first, do no harm. In other words, don't make the kid worse. I think sometimes as mentors, we care about kids, but we could also become overwhelmed with trying to unpack some things. I think it was Joe who said that we're not going to be unpacking, trauma in certain settings. So I think that the first thing that we could do beyond, knowing our limits is to actually establish relationship or a partnership with community agencies and other professionals. So having a network of therapists, of social workers, of psychologists, of trained providers who can unpack these situations. It's complicated, it's layered. Kids don't get into these situations overnight, and it won't take one session to also help them kind of unpack and work through that. So this is an ongoing process. So I think having some network of people that you trust to refer students, children, and families to is a great start. Unfortunately, in having said that, we are experiencing major shortages in mental health care. Schools are overwhelmed, community wait lists are months long, so it's a tough place to be. But although that's the reality, it's still better to refer the young person to someone with the proper credentials and to try to unpack that, though well-intentioned, as a mentor. The other thing I would share is that, excuse me, is that part of the relationship can also be with other community partners that the family might be more open to the message coming from them. So I think about faith-based organizations and other community cultural brokers, if you will, community partners. You could say something as the mentor and it not be as well received as coming from someone who the family might have a little more cultural currency with. So again, your temples, your mosques, your churches, individuals that could reinforce what you're sharing to also help guide them to the proper agency or proper professional for treatment is a major one that I think we could also seek to partner with and expand our networks of support. I love the resource, Joe, that you shared. One of the points on there was confront racism. And I think that is so important that as we're talking about treatment and talking about support, as we're learning these coping skills and mindfulness strategies and techniques, I never want us to lose sight of the systemic reality around kids, that sometimes that has such a significant effect on them. So as you're even looking for providers, I would think about their orientation to their work. Is there an acknowledgement of these broader influences on the child's functioning? And we're not overly or hyper focused on the individual themselves, but really appreciating the context in which they're living and growing, and how we can also empower them with some advocacy around those things as well. So much to really unpack, but I would say know your limits and kind of what you can do as a support, as your relational connection to the young person, but really understanding what's available in your community through public schools, through other private providers, social work, counseling, therapists, and really establishing those connections to get the person to who can be more effective in treating and unpacking the trauma over time.
Oh, thank you so much. And I know that in our work as mentors, this idea of a web of support is not new to us, but thinking about having a web of support as a mentor where you have, clinicians and people that you can go to is a really helpful tool, I think, for us. We're coming down towards the end of our time here, folks. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then I'm going to pass it off to Emma to close us out. I do see a question from Terry in the chat. that says, what is the best advocacy organization to speak up for more funding for youth mentoring? So that's a question that's in the chat, and I can open that up to any one of you that want to jump on that. And then we might have time for one more.
Well, I would jump in. I think we're all, both Mentor Virginia and the Governor's Prevention Partnership are part of the Mentor organization that advocates nationally for mentoring across the country. So that would be, I think, a very first connect with us, connect with your state affiliate, connect with Mentor National. They've got a great website with a lot of resources for you. And also, I would also say there are mental health organizations like NAMI that are very good to connect with too, because, you know, if you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with mental health issues. So that's what I would offer up to you.
Thank you for that, Joe. Any other questions? Feel free to either come off mute or post it in the chat. We've got folks checking the chat.
Hey, Tamis, I had a quick question.
Hey,
This is
David.
David from City of Alexandria. I'm the mentoring coordinator. We oversee about over 16 different mentoring programs. If you all can recommend maybe a training of sort of or a resource that's available currently for us to pass along, what would you advise? So some of our programs can begin to start integrating these trauma-informed responses and this trauma-informed awareness. So to anyone on the panel, what can be done in the interim until programs are able to get full-on trainings for their mentors?
Well, I'll jump in here too. I've been, and I'm not, you know, you guys can take yourself off mute and jump in too. But at the Governor's Prevention Partnership, periodically we do a training called Trauma Informed Youth Mentoring. It's a good introduction. We go a little bit more into depth of what we talked about today in terms of programming for mentors. It's free. And I think we need more. We definitely need more. There are some really good models that are directed towards youth for addressing trauma. Often they require special training and special connections and resources to pay for those models. They may not be as appropriate for a mentoring program. But I think that what I would offer is that, you know, join us, you know, talk to my colleague Aristide Hill, who is on this call, and link up with us, and we can certainly begin the conversation with you. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, so this is more, you know, trainings for trauma specific trainings. I've really invited people to check out Child Savers. They do an introduction to trauma and trauma response here in Richmond, as well as Greater Richmond SCAN. They have like introductory trainings too. My organization, Bare Soul, we work with a lot of our school districts, youth programs, mentor programs to teach mindful-based restorative practices. Both ones like mindful-based restorative relationship. And so many of the administrators and leaders, mentors, school teachers, you know, tend to take these trainings just to kind of really create that restorative culture, restorative language. And they're all based on the 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care. So I think that's important to name and to note. But they can all be found on connection with us can be found on bearsoulyoga.com, or reaching out, and I'll put my contact information as well. But we work with a lot of nonprofits and programs in that way. We do have a program, and we run for programs throughout the year. That's called Mindful Life and Community Fellowships. And so what they are, it's a 10-month program where many of our people that are part of these programs that we work with tend to take, it's all about self-inquiry, learning the practices that you may do for yourself, centered around that knowing thyself, as well as building relationship with others around you. Another pillar of that is integration and then community. So how to address these experiences with all the settings, from family into our community environments. So.
There is a question here in the chat from Busway about whether or not there are any connections to tribal nations, knowing that restorative practices originated in indigenous communities. Do you have connections, thoughts, or links specifically in relation to that?
Yes, and so I'm not familiar with tribal nations, but the majority of our practices, I like to, we kind of really name that our practices are a mix between ancient indigenous practices and modern science, to work within our schools and our health system. So many of the teachers or leaders that have either helped create our programming and or co-facilitate and or just we invite them in to facilitate, are individuals that have been in this work, many of them either identifying as Black, Indigenous people of color and or from various Indigenous communities. And so we are it's very important to us. Specifically, I would also like to name that working within majority Black communities or environments that are serving people of color and or the Black community with the experiences of trauma, it's been really important for us to offer culturally relevant practices, which I think is one reason why we've moved forward so much in this work, is because of that ability to really tap into cultural needs, and understanding that these practices can move across cultures, generations, and experiences, and also honoring where and acknowledging where our practices that we are specifically using are coming from, tied to modern science as well.
Thanks. That's all the time we have for questions. Emma, I'm going to pass it to you.
Yeah, so I just dropped a link in the chat to take a quick survey just to let us know how we can improve for next time. And our next coffee hour is going to be scaling youth leadership opportunities. So that it'll be April 8th if you all are interested April 12th if you all are interested in joining us for that. We also have a new mentor training coming up next month. Each program can send up to 3 participants for free. And then Mentor National has a collaborative mentoring webinar series every month, and they will be talking about scaling youth leadership opportunities as well. Finally, we have our TA, or technical assistance consulting, and we're going to launch a quick poll to see what you all are interested in hearing about in May. So the options include a second part to what we were talking about today, tackling trauma together, equipping mentors to provide therapeutic mentoring, and then talking about compassion fatigue and burnout among staff.
So while people are completing the survey, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate today with my esteemed colleagues, Charles and Ashley. This has been very informative for me. I've really enjoyed sharing, and I want to thank you both, as well as Mentor Virginia, for organizing this.
Echo that. Thank you for having me this morning. Great meeting all of you.
In this morning, such valuable information, and thank you for the work that you are doing, whether you're coordinating or an actual mentor. This work is so important.
Okay, it looks like almost everyone's responded, and everyone loved you all, and they want to hear about tackling trauma some more. So in May, we're going to do a part 2 of Tackling Trauma Together. And thank you all for joining us today.